Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Haley with Haley Stitches, and today I'm going to show you how to make this adorable heart quilt. This quilt uses exactly one charm pack, all 42 squares, and 1 3/4 yards of background fabric. The final quilt will measure 52 inches square. You can grab the free pattern using the link in the description below. It'll be free for 1 week, and after that you can grab it for a low cost in my shop. So grab your charm pack and let's get started. For today's quilt, we'll need 1 charm pack. You're going to be using all 42 squares, 1 3/4 yards of background fabric, a cutting mat, a rotary cutter. You'll need your long quilting ruler, and I'm going to be using some smaller square rulers as well. A matching thread, I love the color Dove by Aurifil, pins, and a marking utensil. Everything I'm using in today's video will be linked in the description below. We're going to start by cutting our background fabric. And I want to show you that I am going to be cutting 8.5 inch wide strips for this pattern, and my ruler is only 6 inches wide. So to get started, we're going to trim off the edge so we have a nice 90-degree angle to work with. And then I'm going to be using the lines on my mat to measure the 8.5 inches. And before you do this, you just want to make sure that the lines on your mat line up with the lines on your ruler. Otherwise, you'll get inconsistent measurements. So as long as both things measure correctly and match each other, you can do this method with no issue. Otherwise, you'll need a wider ruler or to butt up 2 rulers next to each other to get your measurement. So from this background fabric, I'm cutting 5 8.5 inch strips, 2 5-inch strips, and 2 4.5 inch strips. And now I'm going to start subcutting the strips. So I'm trimming off the selvage, and I'm going to stack 2 of the 8.5 inch by width of fabric strips together. I'm going to cut 2 4.5 inch rectangles, and I'll trim the rest of the strip down to 36.5 inches. And there is a cutting diagram in this pattern to make everything super easy for all of these pieces. Next, I'm going to subcut the 5-inch strips. So here I have them stacked on top of each other, and I'm cutting 5-inch squares. And we need a total of 5 5-inch squares from these strips. So I have 4 that I just cut, and now I'm unfolding it to get 1 more. And then I'm going to trim these long strips down to 4.5 inch by 24.5 inch strips. And I am speeding up this background cutting a little bit just because there's a lot of it, and the pattern will give you everything you need. And lastly, from the 4.5 inch by width of fabric strips, we're going to cut 2 4.5 inch squares and 2 32.5 inch strips. Now that we've cut our background fabric, it's time to cut into our charm pack. So the first thing I want to do is separate the colors in the charm pack out, just so I can get a nice scrappy look in my quilt. So what I'm going to do is separate them out into 3 main colors, white, red, and pink. And I'll use these piles to draw from to make the piles that I need for this quilt pattern. So I separated them out into 4 piles, and I made them all pretty even with colors. So the 5-inch squares we're going to leave whole, so I'm going to set those aside for assembly at the end. And then this one down in the corner, we're going to cut into 4ths. So we're going to start with this one. So we're just going to cut it 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches to get 4 2.5 inch squares. And these little squares will be for our border. Next, we're going to cut 20 of our 5-inch squares down to 4.5 inch squares. And I know some of you might think this is a little bit wasteful, but I still think it's worth it for the charm pack just because you get a nice variety of colors and patterns. And I do find it the cheapest way to get a nice variety, especially if you don't have a fabric stash. So we'll do 24.5 inch squares. And lastly, we're going to cut 16 2.5 inch by 4.5 inch rectangles. So to do this, first I'm going to cut that 4.5 inch measurement, and then I'll subcut that down into 2 2.5 inch by 4.5 inch rectangles. So we don't use the entire charm pack square for everything in this quilt, but it does make good use of all of the fabric. And as you'll see, these smaller rectangles are used for the border, and they really are kind of left over in our pattern. So I wanted to make sure we had put them to good use. So here is what our fabric will look like after we've cut everything. We have these long strips We have our rectangles and our squares, and then we have our charm packs cut down into squares, and then the rectangles and the little squares for the border. So we will set aside everything except for our 5-inch background fabric squares and 5-inch charm pack fabric squares. And we're going to pair these together to make our half square triangles. So you'll want one of each, and the first step is drawing a diagonal line on the wrong side of your background fabric. We'll pair it right sides together with our charm pack fabric and sew a 1/4 inch away from the marked line on both sides. Then we're going to trim along that marked line and press. When you're pressing, you'll want to press towards whatever the darker fabric is. In my case, it's the charm pack fabric. And the last step for the half square triangles is trimming it down to 4.5 inches square. So I'm going to be taking my 4.5 inch square ruler, lining everything up, and then trimming from all 4 sides. So you'll repeat that entire 2 at a time half square triangle assembly process for all of the 5-inch squares in this pattern. Now we can start to assemble our heart block. So we're going to take our half square triangles, our 4.5 inch charm pack fabric, and then the 4.5 inch measurements from the background fabric to put together our heart square. So as you can see, I just laid it out according to the pattern with the half square triangles on the edges and then those extra fabric, background fabric pieces on the bottom there. And one thing to keep in mind is you do want contrasting fabric, especially on the outer edges of this heart, so that you get a nice defined pattern. If I had too many white fabrics on the outside, it might not give us a good effect and pop. So what we're going to do is assemble each of these rows together, and then we're going to press the rows in opposite directions. So right, left. This is going to make it so our seams nest and everything lines up nicely. And then we're going to sew all of those rows together to get our big heart block. This big heart block will measure 24.5 inches square. And the next step is going to be attaching our first set of borders. So I'm going to take all of my 4.5 inch strips and we're going to start attaching them as the borders. So we're going to take the shorter ones, the 4.5 inch by 24.5 inch borders, and attach them on the sides. And then we are going to attach the 32.5 inch by 4.5 inch strips to the top and the bottom. And again, pinning is a really good idea here just to make sure everything lines up nicely. And that is going to give us our heart block with a nice, beautiful background border. And this alone could be a quilt or a wall hanging. This would measure 32.5 inches. But this only uses about half of a charm pack. And I like to use all of the fabric in my pre-cuts so that I don't have a bunch of little squares left over. So that is where the next border is going to come into place. We're going to use the rest of the charm pack squares in our charm pack. So we already cut those down to size. Setting aside the 2.5 inch squares, first we're going to assemble the 2.5 inch by 4.5 inch rectangles. So I just made it as scrappy as I could. We're going to sew 4 rows of 8 rectangles. So this is what it looks like after they're all sewn together, and we're going to set 2 of these aside, and then for the other 2 strips we're going to attach those little 2.5 inch squares to the edges. And I chose my deepest fabric for my charm pack for these just so it would frame the heart block nicely and I wouldn't have to worry about losing that border if I chose maybe a white or one that was too close to the background fabric. So we're going to sew these 2.5 inch squares to the ends of each of these strips. This is what we get after we sew all of those strips together. So again, these are just kind of the leftovers from the charm pack, and we can turn them into a beautiful border just by cutting them a little bit and reassembling them. So the ones with the smaller squares on the edges are going to be the top and the bottom, and then the shorter ones are going to go on the left and right. So here we're going to attach one of the strips to the left and one to the right to get our second border on this quilt. And after we do that, this is what it's going to look like, and it's time to sew on our last mini border for this quilt. And that's going to be the ones with the 2.5 inch squares on the sides. So again, pinning can be really helpful on these intersections on the top left and right, just to make sure everything is nicely aligned. And here is our quilt top after that second scrappy border was attached. And as you can see, it frames it really, really nicely. I like how this looks. Again, you could stop here if you wanted to and didn't want to use any extra background fabric, but I am going to attach one last border to this quilt. So the remaining fabric we have are those 8.5-inch strips. So we're going to attach the shorter 8.5-inch by 36.5-inch strips to the left and right of this quilt. And then we need to attach the long strips for the top and bottom. But first we need to assemble them into a long border strip. So there's 3 8.5-inch strips left over that have them all stacked on top of each other right here. So I'm trimming off that selvage, and then I'm just going to line them up end to end, sewing with a 1/4-inch seam allowance until I get one extra long strip. So this extra long strip should measure 8.5 inches by 52.5 inches when you attach it to the top and the bottom. You would have to subcut that super long strip down, or what you can do is just sew it on and then cut the excess and then sew the rest on the bottom and cut the excess, which is what I'm going to do just to save myself a little bit of cutting, but the first method is more accurate. So this is what that final quilt top will look like after all of the borders are assembled. And the last binding on this will give it a nice frame. So here it is pinned up on my design wall, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. I like all of the colors mixed together, and I think a Valentine's Day quilt is super fun. So if you want to get this free quilt pattern, you can click the link in the description below to download it. And if you're watching this video a little bit later and it's no longer free, you can grab this pattern for just $2 in my shop. I can't wait to see what you guys make with this. I think it would look great in so many different color options, and it'd be a super cute toddler quilt or throw quilt year round. If you're looking for more Charm Pack patterns, check out this playlist. I'll see you there.